In 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada, the highest court in the land, agreed. The Mi'kmaq have free liberty of hunting and fishing as usual. And for what period of time? The treaty says forever. Our ancestors signed the treaty eons ago that mentions us today, quote, members and delegates of the said tribe for themselves and their tribe and their heirs forever. We who are here now are their heirs forever.
More than 250 years ago, not far from this spot, the Mi'kmaq and the British signed treaties of peace and friendship. For decades, the treaties were ignored, but Canada's Constitution now affirms their validity. The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld them. Yet today, the Mi'kmaq find themselves in a legal struggle to have their treaties honored and respected. This is the story of that struggle. The Mi'kmaq Grand Council is the traditional authority of the Mi'kma'kiq. For more than 250 years, the Grand Council kept the memory of the treaties alive, even as white Canada forgot them. Some 80 years ago, Grand Chief Gabriel Syliboy moved the issue into the courts. One day in 1929, Chief Syliboy went hunting muskrats. Game wardens charged him under Nova Scotia's Lands and Forests Act.
His defense, when he was charged for trapping muskrat out of season, was the 1752 treaty. However, the court didn't recognize the treaty, that 1752 treaty in 1929, and the judge ruled that it didn't protect Indians from laws that governed the seasons for trapping muskrat and other animals.
The court ruled that the Treaty of 1752 had no validity because the Mi'kmaq who signed it were savages. As such, they were incompetent to enter into a treaty. For more than 50 years, that ruling would stand as the prevailing judicial view on the subject of treaties in Canada. But the Grand Council did not give up.
One section in the treaty says that if anything shall happen, then the acts of our law will fall on them. So it says, okay, use their law. We told a guy in Chapel Island, we need somebody to get caught. We'll pay for your fine. We'll, if your gun is taken, we'll take you to court. And then the guy says, okay, we'll volunteer. And we lost at the in St. Peter's, and then we took it to the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, and we won it there, which only stipulates that provincial laws do not apply on an Indian reserve. One old man who's dead now says, okay, now you have to go and see if that thing still applies on people who are hunting outside the Indian community. And that's when we went to Shuby.
I remember there was P.J. Paul, we used to call him, Mr. Levi Paul, and he went to court one time, but I think that was thrown out on technicalities. Also, Everett Paul had fished salmon out of season, and the circumstances were quite interesting too. At the time when he was fishing up there, he was jigging salmon, and when he hooked the salmon, the DFO guys were there, come on, urging them on and play him, encouraging him to get the fish in, and he got the fish in, and they took it.
The Mi'kmaq tried a treaty defense, but both cases were dismissed on technicalities. Then came the case that would turn treaty law on its head.
James Simon was one of our hunters. He wasn't hunting the day that this salmon case came about. He was out target practicing and driving along a road that was adjacent to the reserve. So they arrested him anyway and charged him with hunting out of season and carrying a weapon out of season without a license. And we went to all the courts in Nova Scotia, They found him guilty, and right up to the Supreme Court of Canada, when we got there, they dismissed the case. And they said that our treaty was as valid as the day it was signed. That was the 1752 treaty.
More than 50 years after a Nova Scotia court dismissed the Mi'kmaq as incompetent savages, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled the treaties were valid. But what was the extent of the Mi'kmaq right to hunt and fish? Could they fish commercially? Could they make their own rules? To answer those questions, the Mi'kmaq turned to the son of another Grand Chief. Donald Marshall Jr. was already famous for spending 11 years in jail for a murder he did not commit. Marshall went eel fishing in deliberate defiance of the Fisheries Act. The Supreme Court of Canada acquitted him. The court ruled that Mi'kmaq have a treaty right to earn a moderate livelihood from fishing. But when Mi'kmaq fishermen attempted to exercise that right, commercial fishermen reacted in fury. Violent confrontations broke out in coastal communities from Yarmouth to New Brunswick's North Shore. Spooked by the violence that greeted its decision, the court issued an unprecedented clarification. Marshall, too, had the effect of weakening the original ruling.
I think that second Marshall decision is the most racist thing that ever happened to us. You know, I don't think anywhere in this country, once a decision is made, that the Supreme Court of Canada, anybody could go back and reverse that decision without us having the opportunity to argue our points. You know, they just unilaterally went there and said, this is what they meant.
Emboldened by the court's clarification, fisheries officers began arresting Mi'kmaq fishermen. For Matthew Cooncombe, it was a stark contrast to the way the U.S. government acted when a Southern governor tried to defy a Supreme Court ruling against school segregation.
Why can't the Canadian government do the same thing to the First Nations when a Supreme Court decision comes down and recognizes our right to hunt and fish, be able to escort the First Nation, they can exercise that right. But they didn't do that to us. So we question, as First Nations, the sincerity of the government of upholding of one pillar of their government, which is Supreme Court decisions. So for the First Nations, if your rights are recognized by law and supported by decision of the Supreme Court, shouldn't the government of the day then respect their law, implement their law, and if they have to use the police or the Department of Fishery and Ocean, game wardens, or if they have to use the army to enforce their laws and decisions of their courts regarding our rights.
The Constitution said the treaties were valid. The Supreme Court said the treaties meant what they said. But violence by commercial fishermen frightened federal politicians. The Marshall clarification gave DFO a pretext to block Mi'kmaq fishermen and appease their white counterparts.
We can't exercise that right when we go to exercise the treaty right. We're arrested, our equipment is stolen from us, and we're charged. End up in court having to spend thousands of dollars trying to defend our rights.
Before the Marshall decision, the Minister of Fisheries had authorized the Indian Brook Band to set 800 lobster traps. Instead of increasing this number, the Mi'kmaq's decisive court victory had the opposite effect.
So after the Marshall decision came down, they reduced us to 35 traps for the summer season, and no commercial, no sale or anything. That was strictly a food fishery, food and social, which is not enough to feed our crew. You know, it's 35 traps used among 400 or 500 people that probably would want to go down and get a few lobster for their families. make one trap each. They'd have to wait all year to get around to get to use one of those tags.
DFO was able to reduce trap limits because the court said it could regulate treaty rights in the name of conservation. But the right to regulate was sharply limited.
They conferred the trump card over Aboriginal and treaty rights onto the federal crown and the provincial crown by saying that any infringement of rights could be justified. And when they conferred that trump card, though, they placed it in a restriction or in a boundary that said that they have to play the card properly, and they have to play the card in a way that is consistent with the honor of the crown and honorable treatment of the Aboriginal people whose rights are being infringed. Part of that honorable conduct includes consulting with the people, and the consultation has to be done in good faith with the objective of substantively addressing the concerns that the Aboriginal rights holders have about the impact of some measure upon their rights and their ability to exercise their rights.
They're trying to criminalize the Aboriginal right to the fishery by the language that they use. The language is that the Aboriginal people are not conservationists and that they're jeopardizing the commercial fishery. This is an absurd allegation, totally ill-founded. The First Nations fishery is a tiny portion compared to the commercial fishery. And if anyone is concerned about conservation in this province, they should start looking at the 360,000 commercial traps used by the non-First Nations fishermen, not the relatively small 800 traps that the Indian Brook want to use and have yet to use.
Objectively, it was hard to see what the fuss was about. White fishermen who set hundreds of thousands of traps accused native fishermen, who set a few hundred traps, of destroying the fishery. The court said Ottawa had a duty to consult the Mi'kmaq before restricting their modest fishery. But when Indian Brook tried to consult, they were ignored.
The Indian Brook community has a management plan to want to fish again in St. Mary's Bay for lobster starting on June the 3rd, and have submitted that plan to the Minister of Fisheries as well as the Minister of Indian Affairs, and have asked for consultations about that plan to see what can be worked out. And other than acknowledging the letter that was sent by Chief Maloney on behalf of the community with the harvesting plans approved by the Chief and Council, other than acknowledging receipt of it, there's been dead silence from the Minister of Indian Affairs, the Minister of Fisheries.
Dead silence. In court, DFO's chief lobster biologist would testify that he never even read Indian Brook's fishing plan. Ottawa wanted nothing to do with special rules for treaty fishermen. Instead, it offered individual Mi'kmaq bands free fishing boats and training if the bands would agree to fish under DFO-issued licenses. There would be no communal fishery, no treaty-based rights, just a few Mi'kmaq with commercial licenses. Many cash-strapped bands accepted the offer and signed agreements binding them to the DFO licenses, not Indian Brook.
One of the reasons why I'm so against signing those agreements is that I think our treaty is worth so much more than a mere agreement. I think those agreements really trivialize the importance or the magnitude of our treaty. That wasn't the idea in the heads of our head of states when they made that treaty. I'm sure that we would be limited to a food, social, and a small livelihood fishery for a few of our people. I think every Mi'kmaq that wants to be able to participate in the fishery should be able to do it to make his livelihood. And when you look at the amount of people that can fish under these agreements, it's only limited to maybe, 20, 30, 40 people go out and make a livelihood for 2 or 3 months, and they have to draw unemployment for the rest of the year. See, the DFO talk about these agreements that the bands are signing as being without prejudice to our rights, and they're not infringements on our rights, but every time they talk about Indian Brook or Burnt Church not signing the agreement, they always point to those other bands and say, well, look, all of these bands, there's 30 out of 34 bands have signed these agreements, and they would like everyone to sign these agreements, you know. Well, everybody doesn't want to sign those agreements. Some people want to try to exercise their treaty rights because they believe in them.
Now, in those treaties, in that so-called covenant chain, which was named by the British, they ended up in exchanging rights between the two parties. And one of the rights that the Mi'kmaq gave to the British was the right to govern themselves here in these territories, in Mi'kma'ki. But by the same token, the Mi'kmaq were to govern themselves. And that's what they've been attempting to do ever since they signed those treaties, but they've never been allowed to do so. Hence, we have all these problems with Department of Fisheries and Oceans of the federal government, wanting to always exert their authority, wanting to be the only authority over fishing in Atlantic Canada. What they don't realize is the strength of those treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq Nation.
You know, there's so little about our treaties written in the history books, and basically, I guess, very little even written about the Mi'kmaq Nation in the history books. That's why people were hoping that we might have forgot, I guess, about our treaty rights, and that's why we as a community want to recognize and pay homage to our great leader, John Baptist Cope, who was the chief in the 1750s and was the one who was the signatory to our to the treaty on our behalf. And we want our children to know who this person is, and we want them to know that we have a treaty, and from that treaty comes some rights, and that's why the council and I decided that we should commemorate this 250th anniversary of our treaty.
In the 5 years since Marshall, most Mi'kmaq bands signed fisheries agreements. These agreements allowed a few band members to fish, not under their treaty rights, but under rules dictated by DFO. By the spring of 2004, only Indian Brook and 2 other First Nations communities continued to hold out. Ottawa wants the Mi'kmaq to negotiate for something that is already a Mi'kmaq right. Ottawa claims to be offering access to the fishery, but the offers made and the access given are nothing more than restrictions of that right. In April 2004, DFO offered Indian Brook $20 million in training, boats, cash, and fishing gear if only they would give in and sign. Chief Maloney and the Band Council resolved to let the community decide.
The right that the people have is a communal right, not an individual right of individual fishermen. It belongs to the community. No one, including the chief and council, can arbitrarily make agreements that violates that right without the consent of the people. It's a communal right.
Despite unemployment and poverty, the Mi'kmaq of Indian Brook voted 2-1 not to fish under DFO-imposed conditions. Today, the chief and council are still looking to Ottawa to deal with them honorably, respecting their treaty right to earn a livelihood. The Supreme Court of Canada decided the Marshall case in 1999. The Mi'kmaq won unequivocally. The treaties are valid, They mean what they say. Marshall was acquitted. But in the 5 years since Marshall, not a single First Nations community in Atlantic Canada has been allowed to exercise its treaty right to fish.
Indian Brook will survive with the help of the outside community. I think the more lawyers we have, and the more that they go out to get help from international law and all those people, and once Canada is being questioned by international field, then they're going to have to change, what it is that what they're doing.
You see, Canadians can't have it both ways. They can't say to our people, welfare bounds, but they cannot stop us when we try to make a living. They cannot both ways.